Hello everyone. Is my voice audible, guys? So anyone have any kind of doubts from the last session or on use reducer hook or any kind of confusion? Use reducer. So dispatch, action, state, reducer function. Okay, these are the terms what we have encountered while exploring this use reducer hook. So anyone else have any kind of doubts on this use reducer hook? Have you guys understood use reducer hook? Let me know on the chat. If you understood, just type 1. If you did not understand or if you are confused, just type 0. I just, yeah. You have to respond, guys, whenever I'm asking something, okay? Don't be silent. I'm just asking whether you have understood or not.
Sir, can we have one more time refresh, a quick refresh?
Yeah. So basically, what is use reducer? So in your interviews, they will ask, what is use reducer? So what will be your answer?
It's a state.
Mm-hmm.
No.
No. Anybody, guys? What is use reducer? If let's assume that you guys are in interview and they are asking what is use reducer. So what will be your answer?
React hook use reducer is.
Pardon?
It's a hook.
Yes. So answer should be it is one of the hook in React. Now, some people might ask you, like, to answer this question, then they can ask you what is hook. What is hook in React? So what will be your answer for this? What is hook in React?
Hook, it's a function. Function.
It is one of predefined function in React with predefined purpose. Predefined purpose. Okay. So any function which starts with word use, all those functions are called hooks. All those functions are hooks. Okay. Now, whenever you call this use reducer, whenever we call this use reducer hook, what it returns? What it returns? Whenever you call this hook, what it returns?
Action of
Array.
No,
It will be written array.
state and
yeah,
display.
that array, how many elements?
2.
Consist of how many elements? Yes, 2 elements.
2
And what are
elements.
those 2 elements?
State and actions.
What are those 2 elements? State and What is the second element?
Dispatch.
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 Okay. So state is like a variable where we can store any type of data. Dispatch is predefined function. Dispatch is predefined function. And use reducer takes how many argument? How many argument it takes?
Two arguments.
Two
One is the
arguments.
action.
Yes,
Dispatch.
what is the first argument?
Function.
Takes
User
two
defined.
arguments.
And initial data.
Yeah. No, first argument. It's one
User-
function and we call that function as a reducer function. And second argument is initial data. So what is reducer? Reducer is a predefined function or it's a user-defined function?
User defined.
It's a user-defined function. User-defined function means we are going to create that function. We are going to define that function. User-defined function. And how many arguments a reducer function is going to take? How many arguments reducer function will take?
One is actions.
One is action and another one is? So the first
State.
argument is state. You will have access to the state and second argument is action. So in first parameter basically in your first parameter, you will have a access of current state value, whatever current state value you have or whatever data you have stored in the current state, that data access you will have. Second is a action where we are going to store the action object. And whatever data this reducer function is going to return, it will be updated inside your state. Whatever data this function is going to return, that data will be updated inside the state. So inside the reducer, we have to write the logic to update our state based on different scenarios or requirement. And this entire pattern we call as a reducer pattern. Okay. So there are two ways to create state in React. Using use state hook and using use reducer hook. You can use any hook to have a state. But generally it is recommended that if you want to perform simple operation or less operations on your state, then better to go with use state. If you are performing any complex operations or multiple operations on your state, then in that case, go with use reducer. So that is just a recommendation. Apart from that, it's completely opinion of a developer what he wants to use. So there are no restrictions that you have to use state only for this situation. For this situation, you have to use reducer only. Like that, they haven't given any kind of restrictions to us. So till now, we have seen that how to share the data between the components. Using props, and we have seen using context API. And these both approaches are recommended to use if we want to pass the data from parent to child. So whenever you have a requirement to pass the data from parent component to child component, then only these two ways are recommended. These two ways are recommended. If you get a requirement to share the data from child to parent, or between siblings, in that case, props and context API is not recommended. For this, both the approaches, props and context API is just not recommended. Remember, it's not recommended. It doesn't mean that we cannot use these approaches to share the data from child to parent or between siblings. If you want, you can use it, but it's not recommended way. Why it is not recommended way? Because it becomes very complex process. It's very complex to share the data from child to parent using props or context API. It's a complex process to share the data from one sibling to another sibling. So let's assume that you have components like this. You have an app component. Let's assume that app component has two childrens, two direct childrens, something like component A and component 1. Component A further has two childrens. Component 1 has further 3 childrens. Let's just assume that. So here component B, there is a component C. And here let's assume that we have a components like 2, 3, and we have 4. Let's assume that again B has 2 childrens like B1 and B2. And let's assume that this child 4 has 2 more childrens like 4-1, 4-2. Okay, let's assume that our application is structured in this way. So all our components are structured in this way. Now, if you get a requirement to share the data from component B2 to component 3, let's assume that you want to share the data from component B2 to component 3. So without using any other technique, if I ask you to use only props or context API, or let's assume that I wanted to use technique called props to share the data from B2 to 3 component. So can you tell me how will you share the data from B2 to 3 component using props concept? So this is the structured how our application is created. Let's assume that our application is created in this way. All our components are arranged in this way. Now I got a requirement to share the data from B2 component to 3 component. So how will you share the data from B2 to 3 using props? Can you guys guess how will you share the data from this component to this component using props?
So we need to render the 3 component in B2 and we need to pass the props and
Components are already arranged in this way. Already your applications have lot of components and all those components are arranged in this way. That is what structure we have drawn. Now you got the requirement to share from B2 to 3. How will you share? You cannot change the sequence of your
Using
components.
props,
It's already
using props, we have to share the data to B to B, then B to A, then app to 1, 1 to 3. That is using props we can.
great. So what we have to do now, from B2 to B, we have to share the data. You cannot share the data directly. Okay. So what we have to do is from B2 to B, we have to share. So here we have to follow child parent approach. From child component parent, we have to pass. Then from B, we have to share the data to A component. From A, we have to share the data to app component. So till here, we are going to follow the approach of passing the data from child component to parent component. And you can imagine how complex it will be to share the data from B2 to app with this approach. Once app receives the data, app will share that data to 1. Then one component can share that data to 3. So this is the flow you have to implement. So sharing the data from parent to child is easy. It doesn't give that complexness. But if you try to share the data from child to parent, then it will be very complex. If you want, you guys can try this scenario whenever you guys get the time using props. So for practice purpose, you can try this part. What you guys can do is you can create one text box here in the B component. You can create one button here and try to add some paragraph inside the 3 component. Now your requirement should be whatever you will type here. And if you click on this button, this data, this text box data, you have to display here. So for this, you have to follow this approach. And it will be very complex process. Okay, let's assume that now I don't want to use props. Instead of props, let's assume that I want to go with the context API approach. So using context API, you have to share the data from B2 component to 3 component. Then how will you do that?
Context API.
First, we need to create a context API.
Okay, first you have to create one context. Let's assume that we have.
Create the context
Yeah.
and
Then
use the context. Use the context.
how will you use? Now this B2 needs to add the data inside this context, right?
Yes.
Somehow B2 needs to add the data inside the context. And 3 needs to access that data from the context. Now, to add the data from B2 to context, somehow this context you have to make available to B2 component. So this context is going to give us provider component, right? Somehow
Yes,
that
yes.
provider component you have to render inside B2 component.
Beautiful. Yes.
And that provider component, inside that provider component, you have to render 3 component. Then only 3 component can access the data of the context. So there are 2 challenging things. First thing, how will you render provider component inside B2 component? And how will you render 3 component inside the provider component? How will you make sure? Because your components are structured in this way. If 3 was let's assume that if 3 is a child of B2, then this scenario was very easy. But right now 3 is not the child of B2. We are not rendering 3 inside the B2. So this is how the situation comes into picture. If you want to share the data between the components which are structured in very complex way. And if you try to use props or context API, it will be very difficult. This is the reason these 2 approaches are not recommended. Only not recommended. If you want, you can implement it, but it's very complex approach. If you want, for practice purpose, you guys can try this part as well. Then only you will understand how complex it will be. So if you try these examples, then you will understand why props and context API we should not prefer for this kind of situations. And if someone is asking you the question, then you will be able to explain in much more better way if you try it. If you just ignore this example and if you just remember whatever I have said, then you might not explain the way it should be explained to an interviewer because you don't have that practical experience. But if you try this example for practice purpose using props and context API, and if you try to share the data from B2 to 3, then you will understand actual complexness with these approaches. And then you will have a practical knowledge why we should not go with these approaches for these scenarios. So everybody has to try this. Okay, I won't check because you guys are professional now. So it's completely your wish whether you want to try this example or not. Okay, so if you have such kind of scenarios, going with props and context API is not at all recommended. Then what is the recommended approach? What is the recommended approach? Now, this is not recommended approach. So anybody knows what is the recommended approach for this scenario? So based on whatever you have learned, do you know any recommended approach for this scenario? This is where your Redux concept comes into picture. This is where which concept comes into picture? Redux. Now Redux is not a part of React. Redux itself is a library. Redux itself is a library. So Redux is not a part of React. So to manage data between our components, if they are structured in a complex relationship, then we go for another library, that is Redux. Now this Redux library you can use with any JavaScript related library or framework. You can use Redux with Angular, you can use Redux with plain JavaScript, you can use Redux with React, you can use Redux with Vue.js, or you can use Redux with any library or framework which is related to JavaScript. Okay, so what Redux says, Redux gives us very simple approach. It's very similar to context API. So Redux says that you just create Redux store. Create one Redux store. Redux store. Make this Redux store available to each and every component of your application. First, create Redux store, then make this Redux store available to each and every component of your application. That Redux store should be available to each and every component of your application. Now, once this Redux store is available to each and every component of your application, then any component can store the data inside the Redux. Any component can store the data inside the Redux. In our case, we want to share the data from B2 to 3. So what this B2 component will do, it will simply store the data inside the Redux. It will simply store the data inside the Redux. Now, once the data is available inside your Redux, now any component of your application can access the data from that Redux. Any component from your application can access the data from the Redux. So 3 component wants the data, so it can access this data from the Redux. That's it. This is how data will be shared between B2 and 3. Now, whenever you are using Redux, you need not to take care about relationship between the components. You can share the data from any component to any component. If you want to share the data from parent to child, for that also we can use Redux. From child to parent, for that also we can use Redux. In between siblings, we can use Redux. Just one component will store the data in Redux, another component will take the data from Redux. This is the simple concept of Redux. Very similar to your context API. Very similar to context API. Concept is very similar to your context API, but the way of implementing is different. Context API is a part of React. Context API technique is created by React people. But Redux is not a part of React. Redux itself is a separate library. So we have to integrate this library with React. Using this library, you will be able to create store. This library will give us some services or some predefined functionality to access the data from this Redux store. So before we learn how to implement Redux, first of all, we have to understand what is the concept of Redux. Concept is very, very simple. One component is going to store the data in Redux. Another component is going to take the data from Redux. Now, any component can store the data in the Redux. Any component can take the data from the Redux. Why? Because this store we are making available to each and every component of our application. So if store is available to each and every component of our application, any component can store the data, any component can take the data. Let's assume that this one component wants to share the data with B2. Okay, let's just assume that this one component wants to share the data with B2. So in this case, what happens? Simply this component 1 will store the data inside the Redux. B2 will access that data from the Redux. Now B2 is doing two things. In one of the scenario, it is storing the data in the Redux because it wants to share that data with 3. In another scenario, it is trying to access the data from Redux. It is trying to access the data from Redux. So depending upon scenario, any component can store the data, any component can access the data. You don't have any such restrictions that one component only can store the data or another component can only access the data. We don't have such restrictions. A component can store the data in the Redux, same component can access another data from the Redux. Understood the concept of Redux, why we are going with the Redux? And this process of sharing the data between the components is called state management. This is what the term used in your React, that is state management, or some people might say data management. So one of the question in your interviews you will get, how to manage state in React applications. How to manage state in React applications. In a lot of interviews, this question will be asked. In how many ways you can manage state in your React application, or how to manage state in React application. So you can manage state in your React application using the concept props, context API, and using some external libraries like Redux. You can use props, you can use context API, you can use Redux. So there are so many libraries in the market, but Redux is one of the popular library which people use with React. Okay. So this is the concept. But storing the data from component into the Redux store is not a straightforward. It is not a straightforward like a context API. In context API, if you want to store the data inside the context, it is very straightforward. Just we have to render provider component, and that provider component will take one props called value, and to that value props, we have to provide our data as a value. So it was very straightforward when it comes to context API. But it is not straightforward to store the data from component to a Redux store. It is not straightforward to store the data from component into the Redux store. like context API. That is the reason people feel Redux is very, very complex concept. But once you understand how to store the data from component into Redux store, once you become master on it, Redux is the most easiest concept what you are going to feel. And once you implement Redux in your application, in your React application, then it will be very, very, very easy for us to manage the data in our application. It will be very easy for us to manage the data in our application. So this concept is very, 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 very important. 90% of your React application contains Redux concept. 90 or 95% of your React applications contains Redux concept. And in your interviews, they are going to ask about the Redux. So concept I have explained you. Now we have to learn how to implement this Redux in our React application. Concept is very simple. Just we have to create Redux store. And once that store is created, that store we have to make available to all the components. Once the store is available to all the components, then any component can store the data and any component can access the data from this Redux. Okay. So what is the concept? Concept is create a Redux store. Second step, make Redux store available to each and every component of React application. Okay, here I am trying to explain you the concept, guys. So practically we have to do all this. Third step, create Redux store, make Redux store available to each and every component of React application. Third step, any component can store the data. Component can store the data in the Redux store. Fourth, any component can access the data from Redux store. This is the concept. Understanding concept is one part, implementing the concept is second part. So before I proceed further, have you guys understood the concept of Redux?
Yes, sir, clear. The concept is clear.
Concept is clear, right?
Yes.
So if
Thank
someone
you.
asks you why we have to use Redux in our React application, then you guys have the answer for it, right?
Yes, sir.
So answer should be, I want to share the data between different components in my React application. So for that, I'm going to use Redux. Now my components can be structured in a simple way, or they might have structured in a complex way. So whatever it might be, if I want to share the data between the components, I'm going to use Redux. Real-time use cases, you will see. One of the use cases, you will have a navbar. In the navbar, you will see that there will be one profile kind of image. So you will have a login. Now let's assume that login page is defined in one component, navbar is created in another component. Now your requirement is whenever user logged in successfully, that user image you want to show on this navbar. Here you want to show that user image, or you want to show here user name as well. Now whenever you are going to log in, nothing but you will enter your username, you will enter your password, you will send one request to a server. With that request, you will send this email ID and password to the server. Now, server is going to receive your request. With that request, they will receive your email ID and password, what you have sent. Now, they are going to check that email ID and password, whether it is registered in their database or not. If yes, if it is registered, then they will send a response to us. And with that response, they are going to send the data of that user. Like whatever data is required, they are going to send that data as a response. Now, once user is logged in, now at front end, we are going to navigate from login page to home page. Now, inside your home page, you will show navbar and you will show your home component. Now, whatever data you got, you will display in the home component also, and maybe some part of data you have to display in the nav component also. So somehow you have to share the data from home component to nav component or login component to nav component. So how will you be able to share the data from one component to another component? This is where Redux concept comes into picture. So like this, you will have a lot of scenarios where you have to share the data from one component to another component. And this Redux concept, if you implement, it is going to enhance the performance of your application. That is the biggest advantage what we are going to get with Redux. It will enhance the performance of your application. Now, how it will enhance the performance of your application, all those things we are going to see practically. But before we enter into use cases, first of all, we have to understand the concept. We have to understand how Redux is implemented. Then we will enter into use case parts. So what is the real-time example where you can use Redux, how it is going to help us. So all this comes under your use case. And all this we are going to implement in our projects. Whatever concepts you have learned, all those you are going to implement in your projects. So right now you are just learning the concept. What is the concept? How to implement the concept with the basic examples. Now, once you know all the concepts, then we will apply all those concepts on our project. Okay. So let's come back here. Now let's try to understand how to implement Redux in React application. To implement Redux in React application, the first step what we have to do is install Redux library. Install Redux library. And how to install Redux library? For that, we have to use a simple command, that is npm install Redux. So before you install Redux library, check your package.json file. And under this package.json file, check dependencies. Check whether you have here something called Redux or not. If you don't have Redux, then what you have to do is simply you have to open a new terminal. And
What is the difference between the dependencies and dev dependencies?
so dev dependencies basically we use for the development purpose only. These are required only for development purpose. So once you deploy your application, you don't require all these dependencies. Okay, these are required for your production part as well. So npm install Redux. Click on enter. Now once it is installed, then here it is going to register. Now tell me, where can I find that Redux library in my application?
Node modules.
Yeah, so it will be downloaded in the folder called node_modules, and it will be registered in the package.json file. This is just a information file. So it is basically, this file is basically saying that all these libraries are installed in your application, and all those libraries are kept under node_module folders. Not only these libraries, if these libraries are dependent on some other libraries, all those libraries are also installed and downloaded in and kept inside your node_module folder. So all the libraries of your applications are kept under node_module folder.
And will it be there in package log? What is package log, Jason?
All that I have explained, right? Have you guys not gone through the sessions? Just refer your previous sessions. Okay, so we have installed Redux library. Second step, create a Redux store. Now, to create a Redux store, this Redux library is going to provide us one predefined function. So we have to import that function and we have to use that function. Use that function. Third step, we have to make Redux store available to each and every component of your application. Make Redux store available to each and every component of your application. To make Redux store available to each and every component of our application, we have to take the help of another library, that is React Redux. So React Redux is another library which is used to integrate React with Redux. So if you want to integrate your React with Redux, then we are going to use a library called React Redux. And using this React Redux library only, we can make the store created by Redux available to our React components. Using React Redux library only, you can make your Redux store available to each and every component of your application, React application. So for this, we have to install one more library, that is React Redux. Now, what is the use of React Redux? In short, we can say that React Redux will help us to integrate React application with Redux library. It will help us to integrate React and Redux. So here we have to install this React Redux library as well. So for this, again, we have to follow the same command, that is npm install React-Redux. So let's install this library as well. Npm install React-Redux. So right now we require these two libraries to work with Redux. That is Redux library plus we required React Redux. In tomorrow's session, freshly, I will explain you how to implement this Redux. So right now we have just learned the concept of Redux and why do we require this Redux. And we have installed the Redux, React Redux. Okay, remember React-Redux is another library. So we have installed React-Redux library as well. This is what, if you remember, in the first session, I have told using React, you cannot create a front-end application. Only using React, we cannot create front-end application. If you want to create a front-end application, you have to integrate some other libraries with React. So only with React, we cannot do anything. With only React, we can create user interface. Apart from that, nothing. Apart from that, we have used React DOM, we have used Babel, we are using Redux now, React Redux, we have used Axios. Like this, we are using multiple libraries. Then we are able to create a front-end application. We are using React routing. React routing is also not a part of React library. That is also a separate library, which will help us to implement routing in our React applications. So like this, we are integrating multiple libraries to create one front-end application. Okay, so today's session was almost theoretical, but it was completely conceptual. So if you understand the concept, then only it makes sense to implement that concept. Okay, now in this Redux, that use reducer concept will come into picture. Basically, that pattern will come into picture. That pattern of calling reducer function using dispatch, passing action object. If you wanted to give some data to the reducer, then that reducer will update your state. That pattern will come into picture. Now in tomorrow's session, we will implement all this. We will create Redux store practically. I will explain you how to create Redux store. I will explain you how to make that Redux store available to your React components using React Redux library. Then we will try to understand how to store the data from one component into the Redux, from React component into the Redux. Okay, so here we are going to understand Redux in two parts. The first part is how to store the data from component into Redux store. Then we will try to understand how to access the data from Redux store into the component. This is very, very easy. This is the only complicated process. So storing the data from component into Redux store is not a straightforward way. We have to follow certain pattern for it. We have to follow certain rules for it. So this is the only part which is complex. But once you understand that part, then it will be very easy for us to implement Redux in our application. And once you implement Redux in your application, it will help you a lot to manage your application in much more efficient way. So I just don't want it to start right now because it will take time and it might become complex if you explain now itself. That is the reason I just wanted to take it on the fresh day. Okay, so before you come to tomorrow's session, make sure you are revising whatever I have taught in today's session. If possible, try to watch this video one more time and try to understand the core concept of Redux. Why we are going towards Redux. It should be very, 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 very clear to you guys. Because we are going to use Redux in our project. Whatever project we are going to create, there we are going to use Redux. That is the reason I just want you guys to be very clear with the Redux concept. Yeah. So that's all guys from my end. Like if you have any doubts, let me know. In case if you don't have any doubts, yeah, you guys can do.
Do you have a class for the create the custom hook?
Yes, we have a class. I will explain you how to create a custom hook. I will take one example and I will explain. Okay.